God became a brand when faith stopped being about a sacred spiritual relationship and started being a tool for profit and power. It happened the moment belief systems started to serve human agendas more than they were serving divine purpose. In the West, it took shape through Christianity's merger with consumer culture, where worship became performance and spiritual fulfillment became a product. In parts of the Muslim world, it evolved through Islam's entanglement with politics, where religion became an instrument of authority and ideology. Both of these transformations in Islam and Christianity share a common thread, and that's when it went from transcendence to transaction. God became a brand when the sacred and the spiritual was redefined based off of what it could offer, whether it was comfort, belonging, legitimacy, or control, rather than what the sacred or spiritual could transform. Now, let me be really clear about what I mean by brand, because I'm not just talking about Christian t-shirts or worship albums, even though we'll get there. A brand is something that carries meaning beyond itself. It's a symbol that tells you who you are, where you belong, and what values you hold. Brands give us identity, they give us community, they promise us something. And the thing is, sometimes that's what people do with God. We've encountered God packaged in ways that feel appealing or convenient or digestible. Sometimes it fits our habits, our schedules, our ambitions. And because of that, depending on how you package God, it can serve other people more than it serves yourself, or it serves yourself more than it serves other people. So when I'm asking the question, when did God become a brand? What I'm really asking is, when did the way we experience God start being shaped for us rather than us shaping the experience ourselves? Now for this video, I'm pulling from some really insightful sources. Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Dumez, I believe. I am pulling from two of Mustafa Akil's books, Reopening Muslim Minds and Islam Without Extremes, and then also an article by a researcher named Craig A. Bartholomew, and it's titled The Role of Brands in Consumer Culture. Can Strong Brands Serve as a Substitute for a Relationship with God? These resources help me in naming the patterns that I've been noticing for a while, but I didn't necessarily know how to explain it. So let's move forward. So in much of the modern West, Christianity has in some ways quietly adopted the language and the logic of the marketplace. What was once centered on discipline, sacrifice, and community has been repackaged into a product of personal empowerment, faith that promises fulfillment more than formation. Churches no longer just spread the gospel, but they're marketing it. The Sunday service becomes a brand experience, the lighting, the music, the messaging, all curated to keep our attention, to make us feel something we can recognize and buy into. This is what many call consumer Christianity, right? A version of faith that is built upon spiritual demand and divine supply. It's not necessarily malicious in intention. It's just how our culture teaches us to engage with everything, even God. We learn to shop for churches that fit, sermons that resonate, and worship that moves us. God becomes something to consume rather than something to encounter. And then there's the prosperity gospel, which might be the clearest expression of the shift that I'm noticing. If you believe and you give, you'll receive. Success and wealth become a sign of divine favor, right? And struggle becomes something to be avoided, not endured with faith. It's religion dressed in the language of self-help and financial return. Easy to sell, but hollow when life gets hard, right? Because struggle is not a part of it. There's a theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I believe. And he calls this cheap grace. So it's forgiveness without repentance, right? Or blessings without transformation. It's faith without the cost of discipline, and spirituality without depth. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with beautiful music or powerful preaching. The problem is when these things become a product, when church turns into a service we consume rather than a community that calls us to grow and transform. In Islam, the branding of God shows up differently, not through consumerism, but through politics. From the earliest Islamic empires to modern governments, rulers have used religion to legitimize power. What started off as an ummah, right, like a community, it slowly became tied to political authority. Obedience to God began to look like obedience to the state. Historically speaking, the caliphs and dynasties used theology to prove that their rule was God's will. For example, the Umayyads taught that their power was divinely chosen, making it a sin to resist. Over time, this belief of power being divinely chosen, it blurred the lines between faith and politics until religion itself became a kind of political brand. In the modern world, this branding continues, but just in different ways. Some governments promote moderate Islam to appeal to Western allies. Others build nationalized versions of Neo Ottoman Islam or archipelagic Islam to shape their country's identities. Either way, God becomes a symbol of authority, and it's not necessarily a symbol of spiritual nourishment or transformation, once again. The same logic shows up in religious movements too, where Islam becomes less about faith and more about control. Belief turns into ideology and disagreement becomes fitna or a rebellion against God. So when religion gets politicized, spiritual diversity starts to look like a threat. Scholars like Mustafa Akil trace this pattern back to the old debates within Islam. At one point, the idea that God's will is beyond human reason began to overshadow more rational and questioning traditions. Truly imagine this with me, okay? Imagine you grew up in a society where you do not question God's will. Some people don't have to imagine it because they live it, but like for those who haven't, imagine that. And then I show up and I'm like, hey, I'm going to cut SNAP benefits from low income families because it's God's will. You wouldn't question it, or you would be uncomfortable questioning it, or you wouldn't know how to question it because you've been taught not to question. You've been taught that if you question me, you're questioning God. If you question God, you're disobeying God. If you're disobeying God, then your faith isn't strong. If your faith isn't strong, then that means what you once believed, how you once connected, is false. And then you have this whole internal conflict that you're going on and this crisis that's really hard to manage. And so it's easier to just go with it, to not question it. That's the society and the psychological mindset that was developed when you start to entangle politics with religion. I digress. So once you remove reason, it becomes easier to mirror divine authority, to say, if you question me, you question God, like I just explained in my tangent. So in this case, God becomes a political brand, one that sold obedience instead of freedom. And when faith becomes a tool for control, believers lose the freedom to question, to wrestle with doubt, to imagine God outside of the boundaries of what the state allows, outside of the boundaries of what the state has created for God. Now, in both Christianity and Islam, this branding of God does the same thing. It replaces spiritual intimacy with institutional utility. The faith that once called people to transcend themselves now helps affirm themselves or control others. And here's the thing I keep coming back to. This isn't just about mega churches or governments. It's about all of us and the way that we show up, the way that we decide to envision the divine. And if we're being honest, we all create God in our own image, right? We create versions of God who aligns with our politics, validates our lifestyles, confirms what we already believe about ourselves and the world, right? There's the God of comfort who never challenges us, the God of prosperity who rewards us with material success, the God of nationalism who blesses our country above others, the God of punishment who condemns everyone we disagree with. And I'm not exempt from this. I've done this too. I still do it, especially when it comes to the idea of having a God of comfort. I've shaped God into being something manageable that fit neatly into my theology, my morality, my sense of justice. And when we do that, when we tailor God to fit our preferences, our ideologies, our ambitions, we lose a few things that are really essential. First, we lose the transcendence that I've been mentioning this whole time. We lose the mystery and the awe, the discomfort of encountering something that's bigger than ourselves. Then we also lose transformation because brands aren't meant to change you, right? They affirm who you already are. They give you an identity. But God, and not even just God, like faith as a whole, spirituality as a whole, is meant to disrupt and dismantle. It calls you to question yourself, to transform yourself into someone better, not to affirm who you already are. And then we lose community, which I think is a really big one because we're losing, I guess, authentic community. I can't think of another word, but authentic community that challenges you. And through that challenge and any struggle you have, they empower you and support you until you're able to stand on your own 2 feet and proudly and confidently and humbly say, this is who I am. With brands, they bring loyalty, right? And it's everyone in the community buying the same thing and believing the same thing because that's what the brand says that you are. And ultimately, we do lose God as God. This one is not necessarily in a religious sense of like looking at how God is described in Islam or Christianity or in the Baha'i faith. Like, it's not that. It's a matter of God being a divine presence that helps challenge us and question us and, in a way, holds us accountable, right? When we repackage God, and we're losing the community, we're losing the transformation, we're losing the transcendence. We're making it easier on ourselves to deal with very big moral and ethical decisions in the day-to-day lives. Hi, editing Rose here. Um, that was an incomplete thought. What I'm saying is that we're making it easier on ourselves to make decisions about moral and ethical things, but moral and ethical things aren't inherently easy, right? They're supposed to make us think, they're supposed to push us and get us out of our comfort zone to understand other perspectives. Wherever we end up with the decision we make with moral and ethical things, the proper critical thinking needs to be applied. And when we lose God and we brand God into something that affirms who we are, we lose the ability to critically think about these moral and ethical decisions because our faith, the God that we've repackaged for ourselves, is just reaffirming who we are rather than pushing us. So that's what I was trying to say. But back to the video. Bye. Think of Israel and Palestine. If you have a packaged version of God who doesn't necessarily highlight empathy or highlight activism and justice, then your perception on Israel Palestine is going to be completely different than someone whose God focuses on justice and focuses on standing up for the underdog and focuses on giving people the opportunity to be who they are. We all decide in the way that we package God what aspects of God are more important instead of seeing God as a whole. Branding at its core simplifies meaning and values in a way that's easy to consume, right? But faith was never meant to be simple or consumable. You're supposed to live with faith, you're supposed to wrestle with it and transform through it. When religion became a brand, the symbol started to overtake the substance of it, right? We wear crosses and crescents and slogans, but we forget the discipline that they represent. We share verses online, but we ignore the vulnerability that they demand. In a branded faith, God, he becomes familiar but not formative, right? He's spoken about often, but he's rarely encountered in a deeper way. We're left with a symbol or a logo or a slogan, right? But not with this spiritual presence that refuses to be contained. So, when did God become a brand? It's when belief turned into marketing and devotion turned into performance, and when we started selling certainty instead of seeking truth. Now, here's where I want to leave this today. I'm not saying all organized religion is bad, and I only talked about Islam and Christianity because I'm Muslim and I grew up in the American South. So I have encountered and experienced and witnessed the different ways that these two religions have branded God. But most, if not all, religions have done this, have branded God in a way that is simple and consumable, or have branded God in a way for profit or political gain. And I'm also not saying that we have to abandon faith communities or step away from religion and spirituality or the spiritual practices that we take part in. All I'm saying is that we need to start noticing when we stopped encountering God and we started consuming God. So maybe the question isn't just about when did God become a brand? Maybe the question is, what would it look like if we stopped branding God, right? What would it look like if we started encountering God again? I don't have the perfect answer, but I'm still sitting with it and trying to think through it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Like, when have you seen God or divine presence be used for political gain or profit? When was it turned into a product or a symbol? And then what does it look like to resist that, right? To return to something more real, more sacred, more whole, a spirituality that isn't confined by the branding that we use. Drop a comment below and let's work through this question together because it's a really heavy question and it's a question that has many, many answers to it. But as always, thanks for being here and keep asking, keep noticing, and keep this conversation blooming. I'll see you guys on Thursday for the next video.